Your tax advice might be right, but if it's too long and complicated, clients won't thank you for it. In this episode, I share 2 questions that will help you to simplify your advice and make it 10 times better. You're listening to episode 124 of the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast that helps UK tax professionals become better. I was in the office one afternoon, at my desk, when Zach, a new addition to the tax team, asked me to review part of a report that he'd written for a client. I started reading it, and I could see that it was about legal precedent in tax, which is not an easy topic, but it feels like I'm reading a chapter from a law textbook. The client could end up earning a 2-1 in law after reading this. Everything in there was correct, but it was long, detailed, and complicated. It reminded me of how I used to write advice myself, but after a long fee dispute with a client some years back, I learned a hard truth that clients don't want technical advice. They don't want to read complicated tax analysis. They just want to understand what matters to them. A tax partner I worked with taught me how to do that, how to make advice clear, simple, and useful to a client. So as I was reading Zach's draft, I knew I needed to tell him that it was too complicated. But this kind of feedback can be tricky, especially with someone that you don't know that well. When I finished reading it, I asked Zach, "Why are you telling the client this? What do you want them to know?" He thought for a moment. I said, "I think what you're really trying to tell them is that they can't rely on this tax case, but that it helps them to support the position. And if that's the message, then just say that they don't need the rest." He went away, rewrote the section and sent it back over. It was much shorter, just a few lines versus a few paragraphs. It was quicker to read. It was easier to understand. It was a huge improvement, all from 2 simple questions. Why are you telling them this? What do you want them to know? In this case, that took a few paragraphs of complicated information into something that was simple, short, and easy for a client to understand. Okay, so that was the story, and that is a real story, although there is a name change. It's been a while now since I reviewed the first draft of this, but the gist of the first version went something like this. There is a concept of legal precedents in tax, and there is binding precedent and there is persuasive precedent. And in this case, the case that we're dealing with was a first-tier tribunal case, which means that it doesn't have binding precedent. What that means is that HMRC or you can't rely on this in a court, and that no other court will need to follow it, but what it does mean is that it will support your case. If it does ever go to tribunal, it will support that position. So I'm exaggerating a little bit there to make the point of how complicated we can make these things in a client piece of advice, but there's a lot of information there that you can probably see is not going to be particularly helpful or appreciated by a client. There's a lot being said there and it's quite complicated. So the thing to think about is, what do you want the client to know? What are you trying to tell them? And in this case, all the client needed to know is that there's a position that they were taking that was in a grey area of tax, which means that there's no definitive answer either way. And that case will support their position if it goes to tribunal in the future or if HMRC dispute it, but it's not something that they can rely on. And that is all the client needs to know. And so what we've taken there is a few paragraphs of complicated information. And you could say it's not even that much because you've taken something that's like 3 paragraphs, 3 sentences, so it's not a major reduction. But if you do that throughout a whole report, the whole report's going to be a lot shorter, going to be a lot easier for the client to digest it, which means that they're going to feel like they understand your advice, which feels to them much better than if they get a bunch of complicated information that they can't really do anything with or don't really understand. It'll always come across better to a client if it's simpler and they can understand it. For the first few years that I worked in tax as well, my inclination, my natural way of dealing with these things was to put a lot of this technical information in there as well. But it's only after having that one client circumstance where there was a fee dispute, which was because my advice the client thought was too technical and they didn't appreciate it. Because of that and a bunch of advice I've had over the years and feedback I've had from people I've worked with, I've adapted my approach a lot. But I do know that this is difficult to do, and it's not something that I find necessarily easy to do now, but I'm able to do it if I stand back and think about it. So there's a few areas that I think are easy to address. One is the use of jargon. And by jargon, I'm talking about language that is specific to tax that you understand because you work in tax, but people outside of tax probably don't understand, or at least you shouldn't assume that they understand it. So one way to simplify something like this is to remove all jargon entirely. Sometimes it's just going to be easier to use jargon. And in the cases where you do need to use it, you just need to make sure that you clearly explain what that jargon means so that the client can then understand that jargon. But do not assume that they understand what it means, and try and avoid using jargon where possible. That will help for sure. Also, you need to think about what exactly does the client need to know? Because it is very tempting for us to tell them pretty much everything that we know about a certain tax rule or something along those lines. But the thing is, the client probably doesn't need all that information. So we just need to think about exactly what it is that the client needs to understand, what it is that they need to know, and then work backwards from that to only give them information that they need to be able to understand the point that you want to make. After all, we are there to give advice. We're not there to educate them on tax. But to give advice, sometimes we do need to bring you on a journey to understand something about tax so that they can make a decision based on our advice. If you're a bit of a perfectionist like me, then you might be thinking the next time you write advice that you want to try and incorporate all this stuff that I'm talking about here. If you just try and incorporate that into your first draft, you're probably going to find that quite difficult, and you'll probably be in a state of not really doing anything. And so what I suggest you do is that first off, you just write that element or that advice as normal, and then come back to it afterwards and review it yourself with the questions in mind that we talked about. Why is it that you're telling the client this? What is it that you want them to understand? And then refine it based on that. So that's when you can delete things and tweak things and make it simpler. Doing it that way will stop you procrastinating and just taking ages to write a draft. You'll find it quicker if you draft something first, how you currently do it, and then refine it. Even though you're essentially doing two pieces of writing there, it should take you less time overall to do those two things than it would be just trying to incorporate it all into your first draft. What we've gone through in this episode so far is one tiny scenario, giving you one piece of advice that's related to that scenario to help you to get better. What I'm starting to further help tax professionals like you is something called the Tax Lab. One of the best ways to sharpen your skills as a tax professional is to see how others tackle real life scenarios that we encounter in tax. And that's exactly what we do inside the Tax Lab, giving you practical takeaways that you can apply straight to your work, just like the tip that I've given you in this episode. You can sign up for free at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/the Tax Lab. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/the Tax Lab. That link is also in the description for the episode and in the show notes. I've got an exercise for you to try the next time that you're drafting some tax advice, whether you're drafting the full tax advice or just a part of it. What I want you to do is I want you to draft the advice as normal, as you normally would. And before finalising your draft, what I want you to do then is take a step back and ask yourself two questions. Why have you put that information in there? What is it that you want the client to take away? And I want you to then refine what you've written based on that, cutting out any information that doesn't help you achieve the objective in terms of what you want the client to take away. So I hope you enjoyed the story that I shared at the start, as well as finding the little lesson that I shared from that helpful for you in your tax role as well. So you heard me mention the Tax Lab a few minutes ago. The Tax Lab is an extension of this podcast, a place to go deeper and see my approach in action. In each free session of the Tax Lab, I tackle a real scenario live and walk you through my thinking step by step so that you can sharpen your skills and build confidence. Over time, that means less reliance on others, less stress, more efficiency, high quality work, and quicker career progression. You can sign up for free at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/the Tax Lab. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/the Tax Lab. That link is in the episode description and also in the show notes. And the show notes can be accessed at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP124. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP124. And TTPP124 just stands for the Tax Professionals Podcast, episode 124. The next session of the Tax Lab is actually 2 days after this episode is released, which means that the Tax Lab session is on the 15th of October. That one's going to be on tax advice, and I'm thinking of doing one maybe 2 or 3 weeks later as well, also on the topic of tax advice. Not all Tax Lab sessions, though, will be on the topic of tax advice. They'll be on anything related to working tax, so it could be on tax research, which there definitely will be some on, and it could be on other things as well, like winning work, writing proposals, dealing with complicated conversations with clients, whatever it is. I haven't decided on what all the future topics are going to be yet, but basically anything related to working in tax, where I can share my approach and insights into how I do something to how you get better, then that theoretically can be a Tax Lab episode. So feel free to send me some suggestions if you do want something particular covered. But that's it for this episode. I hope you found the episode useful and have taken away something useful to help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.